For nearly 2 centuries, the Byzantine Empire, heir of Rome, seat of the Orthodox Church, paid tribute to people who had no cities, no written language, no fixed capital, and no formal government beyond clan authority. Gold, silk, weapons, food, political marriages, whatever it took to keep the Pechenegs out of the Balkans. Then, in April 1091, at the Battle of Levundion in what is now European Turkey, the Pechenegs were destroyed in a single afternoon. Byzantine and Cuman forces surrounded the main Pecheneg encampment, men, women, children, livestock, everything, and killed almost everyone inside. Byzantine chronicles record the aftermath in one phrase: "A great people perished in a single day." Archaeologists across the Ukrainian and Romanian steppe have found their Kurgan burial mounds, weapons, horse gear, ornaments of genuine craftsmanship, physical evidence that these people existed. What they have not found is any trace of what happened to the survivors after Levunion. So, who were the Pechenegs? And how does a people that made Rome's heir pay tribute for 2 centuries vanish completely in a single battle? The Eurasian steppe is the largest continuous grassland ecosystem on Earth. A belt of flat or gently rolling terrain stretching approximately 5 zone miles from Hungary in the west to Manchuria in the east, averaging 300 to 500 miles in width, intersected by rivers but largely without the natural barriers that shape political geography in the forested zones to the north or the mountainous, agricultural zones to the south. For the peoples who lived on it, the steppe was both homeland and highway, a landscape that rewarded mobility, punished anyone who tried to control it by building permanent structures, and gave an enormous military advantage to those who had mastered the specific skills of horse-based warfare. The climate of the western Eurasian steppe, the Pontic-Caspian steppe between the Caspian Sea and the Carpathian Mountains, alternated between dry summers and cold winters with a regularity that pastoral communities learned to exploit through the vertical migration of herds. Upland pastures in summer, lower sheltered valleys in winter, with the annual movement of tens of thousands of horses, cattle, sheep, and goats organized by the social structures of the clan and the kinship group. A community that managed this migration effectively could maintain very large herds, and a community with very large herds was wealthy by the measures that mattered in the steppe economy, in the ability to feed a large military force, provide the horses that made cavalry operations possible, and sustain the population through the bad years when drought-reduced pasture and disease struck the herds. The 9th century, when the Pechenegs first clearly emerge in the historical record, was a period of unusual pressure on the western steppe. Population growth in the steppe communities east of the Caspian had been generating westward pressure. Each group, pushed by its eastern neighbors, pushed the groups to its west, a domino effect that was a recurring feature of steppe political dynamics. The Pechenegs were, in this period, one of several Turkic-speaking groups in the area east of the Caspian and Aral Sea, inhabiting the zone that medieval geographic sources call the Oghuz steppe, the homeland of the broader Oghuz Turkish Confederation, of which the Pechenegs were a component before the pressures of the period set them moving westward. The specific mechanism of the Pechenegs' westward displacement is documented in Byzantine sources that collected information from travelers, diplomats, and the steppe communities themselves. According to Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos, the Byzantine emperor and scholar who compiled the administrative handbook De Administrando Imperio around 950 CE, the Pechenegs were driven from their original territory by a combined attack from the Oghuz Turks to the east and the Khazars, from the lower Volga and Don regions. Pressure from 2 directions simultaneously made their original territory untenable. They migrated westward, displacing the Magyars who had previously occupied Pontotontics north of the Black Sea. The Magyars, pushed westward in turn, eventually settled in the Pannonian Plain, modern Hungary, becoming the ancestors of the Hungarian people, the specific political event that triggered the Pecheneg westward migration, the combined attack by the Oghuz Turks and the Khazars that Constantine VII describes reflects a pattern that recurs throughout steppe history, the domino effect in which military pressure at one point of the steppe political system propagates westward, with each displaced group pushing the groups to its west in turn. The Pechenegs were not the first people displaced by this mechanism, and they would not be the last. The Cumans, who would eventually destroy the Pechenegs, were themselves being pushed westward by the pressure of steppe. Further east, and the Mongol invasion of the 13th century would push the Cumans westward in turn into Hungary and Bulgaria, repeating the cycle. The steppe's political dynamics were essentially cyclic. Periodic consolidations of power in the east generating pressure that propagated westward until it hit the agricultural civilizations of Europe and the Mediterranean, where it was either absorbed or deflected. The linguistic and genetic identity of the Pechenegs has been a subject of sustained scholarly investigation since the 19th century, producing conclusions that remain partially contested, but whose general outlines are now reasonably clear. The Pechenegs spoke a Turkic language, documented in a small number of personals' names and ethnonyms preserved in Byzantine and other external sources that belong to the Oghuz branch of the Turkic language family, the same branch that includes modern Turkish, Turkmen, and Azerbaijani. They were, in terms of language and general cultural affiliation, part of the broad world of Turkic-speaking steppe peoples that extended from the Chinese frontier to the Carpathians. The genetic evidence from ancient DNA extracted from Pecheneg period burial sites is, as of the early 2020s, fragmentary but informative. Studies analyzing human remains from Kurgan burials in Ukraine and Romania attributed to the Pecheneg period have found genetic profiles consistent with a population of mixed Eurasian steppe ancestry, combining Central Asian components similar to those found in other Turkic steppe peoples with some Eastern European components reflecting the absorption of local populations. This picture is consistent with what the historical sources describe, a core population of Turkic-speaking steppe origin that had expanded and incorporated diverse elements over the course of its westward migration and 2 centuries of dominance in the Pontic steppe. The Pechenegs were organized, according to Byzantine sources, into 8 tribes, each called an order, a Turkic word for camp or court that eventually gives English the word horde, each subdivided into smaller clan units. The 8 tribes were not a unified state. They were a confederacy whose members shared a common identity and were capable of collective military action when circumstances required, but whose day-to-day political organization was decentralized to the level of the clan and the individual family group. Leadership at the tribal level was held by men whose authority, derived from a combination of hereditary claim, demonstrated military competence, and the ongoing consent of the people they led, a form of leadership that was powerful in military operations but fragile in the face of sustained external pressure that required the kind of coordinated, long-term political decision-making that a more centralized authority could have provided. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, writing about the Pechenegs in De Administrando Imperio, was not describing them out of intellectual curiosity. He was providing his successors with a practical guide to managing a relationship that had been a central preoccupation of Byzantine foreign policy for over a century. His specific observation that so long as the Emperor of Constantinople is at peace with the Pechenegs, neither the Turks can come upon the Roman dominions, captures the geopolitical logic that made the Pechenegs so important to Byzantine strategy. They were the buffer between Byzantium and the other steppe peoples to the north and east, a buffer that cost money to maintain, and that periodically turned into a threat when Byzantine payments were insufficient, or Byzantine politics gave a Pecheneg faction reasons to raid rather than defend. The Pecheneg personal names, preserved in Byzantine and Rus sources, are one of the primary sources for understanding their linguistic tradition. Names like Kagan, Tirak, Tutemgri, Korkutay. These are recognizably Turkic names, phonologically and morphologically consistent with the Oghuz Turkic tradition that the other linguistic evidence identifies. The specific personal naming conventions visible in these names, the use of animal names, celestial terms, and virtue or title words as personal names, are consistent with documented Turkic naming traditions and provide indirect evidence for the cultural world from which the Pechenegs came. The Byzantine administrative documents that record diplomatic transactions with Pecheneg leaders preserve more names than any other source, because the Byzantines needed to identify specifically who they were dealing with when distributing their payments. Constantinople's geographic position made the Pontic-Caspian steppe north of the Black Sea one of the most strategically consequential pieces of geography in the medieval world, not because it contained urban centers or concentrated populations, but because of its position relative to the political entity surrounding it. To the south was the Byzantine Empire and its Crimean and Caucasian territories. To the west were the Balkan states, and beyond them, the Latin Christian world of Western Europe. To the north were the forest steppe communities of Kievan Rus, the earliest Slavic state formation, centered on the Dnieper rivers and its commercial routes connecting the Baltic to the Black Sea. To the east were the other steppe peoples, the Khazars, the Cumans, the Oghuz, whose relationships with the Pechenegs alternated between alliance and conflict. The rivers were the critical geographic features. The Dnieper, flowing south from the Russian forests through the steppe to the Black Sea, was the primary commercial highway connecting Scandinavia and northern Europe to Byzantium, through the famous route from the Varangians to the Greeks. The Pechenegs' control of the steppe territory through which this river ran gave them a choke point on one of the most commercially important trade routes in medieval Europe. They could tax the river traffic, attack the porge routes, where boats had to be carried overland around the river, rapids, and threaten the Byzantine grain supply that depended on the Black Sea coastal territories. The Byzantine sources document the Pechenegs' use of this geographic leverage in considerable detail, because Byzantine merchants and government officials experienced its consequences directly. The 7 rapids of the lower Dnieper, where boats had to be hauled overland or through shallow water by their crews while cargo was portaged, were the specific points where Pecheneg attack was most dangerous and most profitable. Constantine VII, the Administrander Imperio, devotes a substantial section to describing each rapid and the specific Pecheneg attack methods used at each one, along with the countermeasures that Rus traders employed. Evidence that this was not a theoretical threat, but a recurring practical problem requiring systematic management. The control of the steppe territory between the Dnieper and the Danube also gave the Pechenegs leverage over Byzantine Thrace and the access routes to Constantinople from the north. Byzantine military campaigns in Bulgaria and the Balkans were constantly complicated by the need to guard against Pecheneg attacks from the rear, and Byzantine diplomatic policy was frequently shaped by the calculation that a payment to the Pechenegs was less costly than a campaign that left the northeastern frontier exposed. The Pechenegs understood their geographic value and exploited it with the consistency of people who had no other significant source of income. For 2 centuries, the geography of the Pontic steppe was one of the Byzantine Empire's most expensive strategic problems. The Byzantine trade with the Khazar Empire, the Jewish converted Turkic state that controlled the lower Volga and had been the Pechenegs' eastern neighbor. Before the Pechenegs' displacement, provides useful context for understanding how the Pechenegs' position in the Pontic steppe connected to the broader commercial geography of the medieval world. The Khazars had controlled much of the same steppe trade that the Pechenegs would later dominate, and Byzantine diplomatic and commercial archives document the transition from Khazar to Pecheneg dominance in the steppe zone as one of the periodic renegotiations that the steppe people's shifting political landscape required. The specific commercial practices that the Pechenegs inherited from the Khazars, the toll collection system, the protection rackets on the river trade routes, the management of the nomad set to sedentary exchange system, were not Pecheneg inventions. They were the standard operating procedures of steppe political economics that each dominant steppe people adopted from its predecessors. The Pechenegs' emergence as the dominant power of the western Eurasian steppe in the late 9th and early 10th centuries was rapid, a transition from a group under pressure on the eastern steppe to the masters of the territory between the Volga and the Danube, accomplished within approximately a generation. The specific military and organizational capabilities that made this possible were not exotic innovations, but the refined application of the steppe nomadic warfare tradition to a specific geopolitical opportunity. The displacement of the Magyars from the Pontic steppe in the late century, accomplished by Pecheneg pressure from the east, possibly coordinated with Bulgar pressure from the west, was the foundational military success that established the Pechenegs' territorial base and their reputation. The Magyars who fled westward into the Pannonian plain carried stories of Pecheneg military capability that contributed to the terror that the Pechenegs' name began to inspire in European sources. The Western chronicles that first mention the Pechenegs do so in the context of the Magyar migrations and the association between the two peoples in Western European consciousness meant that Pecheneg military reputation was amplified by proximity to the Magyars' own formidable reputation. The relationship with Byzantium established itself quickly. Within years of the Pechenegs' arrival in the Pontic steppe, Byzantine diplomatic missions were making contact and opening negotiations. The Byzantine approach to steppe peoples was, by the late 9th century, thoroughly systematized. Assess the military threat, determine the minimum payment necessary to secure non-aggression or active alliance, and integrate the steppe people into the Byzantine diplomatic network as subsidized buffer states or mercenary allies. The Pechenegs fit this template precisely, and the Byzantine payments that began in the late 9th century continued, with variations in amount and regularity until the early 11th century. The military raids on Byzantine territory that accompanied and periodically replaced these diplomatic payments were not expressions of Byzantine diplomatic failure, but part of a negotiating dynamic that both sides understood. A Pecheneg raid on a Byzantine border region was a demonstration of capability and a statement of grievance. Too little payment, or a payment delayed, or a Byzantine military action in the steppe that threatened Pecheneg interests. That was followed by negotiation and typically a renewed payment. The Byzantines grumbled about this system, but participated in it because the alternative, a sustained military campaign to the Pecheneg threat permanent spently, was more expensive and less certain than maintaining the payment relationship. The Pechenegs had found the optimal economic model for a stateless military power. Make your protection valuable enough that paying for it is cheaper than fighting. The specific question of why Byzantine payments to the Pechenegs continued for so long, why the most sophisticated state in the medieval world could not find a more effective solution to the Pecheneg problem than permanent subsidy, is one that the historical sources address only indirectly, but that the logic of Byzantine strategic culture makes comprehensible. The Byzantine approach to external threats was systematically calculated. Military campaigns were expensive, uncertain in outcome, and created obligations that were difficult to fulfill. Diplomatic payments were expensive but certain, and the relationship they created was manageable within the existing administrative framework. The Pechenegs were not the only people the Byzantines paid to maintain peace. They were one item in a comprehensive system of diplomatic subsidy that was the Byzantine Empire's primary external security instrument. The military capability of the Pechenegs derived from the specific combination of physical skills, tactical doctrine, and organizational flexibility that characterized the best steppe nomadic military systems. Every Pecheneg man was, by the conditions of his upbringing, a trained horseman and archer. He had learned to ride from early childhood, in conditions that made falling off a horse a routine consequence of normal play rather than a crisis requiring special recovery. He had learned to shoot the composite recurve bow, the primary artillery weapon of the steppe tradition, at ranges and accuracy levels that reflected years of practice. He had learned the specific management of horses in military conditions, how to control a mount while shooting, how to maintain formation in a charge and disperse in a retreat, how to manage the horse's energy across the distances that steppe military operations required. The composite recurve bow that the Pechenegs and other steppe peoples used was one of the most sophisticated weapons available in the medieval period, a multi-layer construction of wood, horn, and sinew that stored more energy in a smaller size than any other bow design known to the medieval world. A Pecheneg warrior on horseback with a composite bow was a mobile artillery unit, capable of delivering accurate fire, at ranges of 150 to 200 meters, from a moving platform in any direction including directly behind the rider, at rates of fire of perhaps 6 to 8 aimed shots per minute. The specific combination of range, mobility, and rate of fire created a tactical problem for medieval infantry and cavalry that had no simple solution. The tactical doctrine that the Pechenegs and other steppe peoples applied, the feigned retreat, was described by Byzantine military manuals with a combination of admiration and anxiety. A Pecheneg force would engage an enemy cavalry or infantry formation, draw fire and provoke a charge, and then flee in apparent disorder, drawing the pursuing force away from its own support, strung out across the steppe in pursuit, with its discipline disintegrated and its energy expended. At a pre-planned point, the fleeing force would wheel and return, now facing a disorganized and exhausted enemy, and deliver a charge that typically destroyed whatever remained. The feigned retreat required tremendous discipline. The instinct in apparent flight is to keep fleeing, and reversing that instinct under the stress of actual pursuit required exactly the kind of practiced, ingrained control that years of training could provide. Byzantine military manuals specifically warn their readers about the feigned retreat noting that it was the tactic most likely to destroy an army that could not be defeated by frontal assault. The fact that Byzantine commanders continued to fall for it, despite the warnings, reflects the difficulty of maintaining discipline among troops who believed the enemy was genuinely fleeing and who saw in the pursuit the prospect of individual profit through capture and looting. The Pecheneg military system exploited human psychological tendencies so consistently and so effectively that 2 centuries of documented encounters produced no reliable Byzantine tactical counter. The horse equipment found in Pecheneg period burial mounds, and particularly the saddles, stirrups, and bridle fittings, whose specific design is diagnostic for Pecheneg cultural attribution, reflects a material culture of genuine sophistication. The decorated stirrups in particular, whose geometric and figurative ornamentation was achieved through a combination of casting, engraving, and applied metalwork, represent a level of craft skill that required specialized training and access to specific materials. The distribution of high-quality horse equipment across the range of Pecheneg kurgan assemblages, from the most elaborate elite burials to the more modest burials of ordinary warriors, suggests that the value placed on horse equipment was not simply elite status display, but reflected the genuine centrality of the horse to every level of Pecheneg social and economic life. The political organization of the Pechenegs was, by the standards of centralized states, almost anarchic, and that semi-anarchic quality was both a source of strength and, ultimately, a fatal vulnerability. The 8 tribes had no permanent paramount leader. Military command in intertribal operations was exercised by leaders whose authority was consensual and temporary, based on demonstrated capability and the ongoing agreement of the tribal leaders to follow specific commands in specific situations rather than on any permanent institutional authority. This organizational structure produced a military force of remarkable flexibility and resilience. There was no command structure that could be decapitated by killing a single leader. There was no administrative headquarters that could be captured and ransomed. There was no bureaucracy whose disruption would paralyze operations. Byzantine attempts to solve the Pecheneg problem by assassinating specific leaders or by bribing specific leaders into submission consistently failed because there was always another leader, and because the Pecheneg political system had no mechanism by which a leader who had accepted Byzantine payments could compel the other leaders to honor the arrangement. The Byzantine documents that record the diplomatic history of the Pecheneg relationship repeatedly note this problem, that agreements made with one Pecheneg leader or group of leaders could not be enforced on the other leaders, and that a peace treaty the Byzantines believed they had secured with the whole Pecheneg nation was, in fact, only an agreement with a specific faction. Constantine VII, in De Administrando Imperio, explicitly advises the emperor that gifts should be distributed not to one Pecheneg leader, but to all the clan leaders simultaneously, precisely to prevent the situation where favored leaders were seen by their rivals as Byzantine clients and, therefore, legitimate targets for intertribal violence. The violence that the Pechenegs directed toward each other was real and consequential. The historical sources document episodes of intertribal conflict that reduced Pecheneg military effectiveness at critical moments. Most importantly, in the years leading up to Livonion, when the Pecheneg Confederation was simultaneously facing Byzantine military pressure, human pressure from the east, and the internal consequences of defeats and leadership crises that had fragmented the tribal structure. The organizational strength that had served them well in 2 centuries of dominance became a weakness when the specific conditions of 1091 created a crisis that required coordinated response from a unified political authority that the Pechenegs simply did not have. The specific mechanism by which Pecheneg clan leaders maintained their authority. In the absence of hereditary succession rights, permanent administrative apparatus or coercive enforcement capacity is one of the more interesting questions in steppe political sociology. The evidence from Byzantine and other sources suggests leadership was maintained primarily through the demonstration of military competence and the distribution of wealth. A leader who won battles and shared the proceeds maintained followers. A leader who lost battles or failed to distribute wealth adequately lost followers to rivals who could offer better returns. This system was extraordinarily effective at selecting for military capability. Incompetent leaders were quickly replaced. But it was structurally incapable of producing the long-term policy commitments that managing a complex external relationship, like the one with Byzantium, required. The Pechenegs had no empire in the sense of a fixed territorial entity, with a capital, a court, and an administrative apparatus. What they had was a way of life organized around the horse and the herd. A mobile, flexible, extraordinarily demanding form of existence that produced, in exchange for the hardship it imposed, a military capability unmatched by any contemporary sedentary civilization. The basic unit of Pecheneg social and economic organization was the family group, the extended family that traveled together, maintained its own herd, made its own decisions about movement and pasture, and organized its own defense in the frequent conditions where formal tribal military organizations was absent. The family group's wealth was counted in horses, cattle, sheep, and the material goods that trade and raiding produced: metal weapons, silk fabric, silver and gold ornaments, the functional items of the pastoral economy. The horses were the most valuable component of this wealth, serving simultaneously as the primary transport and communication medium, the essential military platform, and a marker of status and prosperity. A Pecheneg family's standing in the social hierarchy was visible in the quality and quantity of its horse herd, and the loss of horses to disease, theft, or enemy action was an economic catastrophe with direct military implications. The diet of the Pechenegs was, by the standards of agricultural societies, extremely limited in variety but adequate in nutrition for people whose physical demands were high. The primary foods were meat and dairy products from the herds, fresh meat when animals were slaughtered, dried and smoked meat carried as campaign rations, and milk in its various fermented forms, including the mare's milk fermented into kumis, that was the characteristic beverage of the steppe peoples. Kumis, mildly alcoholic, nutrient-dense, easily carried in leather containers, was a complete food in itself, providing protein, fat, vitamins, and hydration in a single portable package. Byzantine sources describe the consumption of horse meat with the specific combination of disgust and fascination that an agricultural civilization applies to the dietary practices of pastoral peoples. But horse meat is nutritionally excellent and was the practical fallback when horses died on campaign. Children in Pecheneg society began learning the essential skills of adult life: riding, archery, the management of animals, from the earliest age at which they were physically capable. The riding skills of steppe peoples, acquired in childhood from before the age at which most children in agricultural societies were permitted near horses, produced its physical integration with the horse was qualitatively different from that of riders who learned as adults or in formal military training. Byzantine military observers noted this quality: the specific ease and precision of steppe cavalry that came from riding being as natural as walking. This was the foundation of Pecheneg military power. Not superior weapons, not superior tactics, but superior horsemanship, developed over an entire childhood of daily practice. The seasonal migration patterns of the Pechenegs, which the Byzantine sources describe in enough detail to allow partial reconstruction, organized their annual movement around the specific grazing requirements of the horse herds that were both their economic base and their military platform. The summer pastures in the higher steppe, where cooler temperatures and better quality grasses sustained the herds through the hottest months, were typically located north of the Black Sea coast. The winter quarters in the lower river valleys, where the combination of shelter from the worst steppe winds and access to water through ice or open channels allowed the herds to survive the coldest months, were concentrated near the Dnieper and the Danube. This annual cycle, covering hundreds of kilometers, organized the entire social calendar of Pecheneg life, determining when raids could be mounted, when diplomatic meetings could occur,
and when the largest gatherings of people and animals were available for military mobilization.
The Pechenegs built no cities, and this was not a failure of ambition or capability. It was a deliberate adaptation to the specific conditions of the steppe environment and the specific demands of the pastoral economy. A city requires water, agricultural surplus, defense in depth, and a population that has chosen to invest in the long-term productivity of a specific place over the flexibility of mobility. The steppe offered water, the rivers and streams crossing the grassland, but no agricultural surplus and no natural defense in depth. What it offered instead was the specific advantage of mobility, the ability to be where you needed to be, when you needed to be there, to concentrate force rapidly and disperse equally rapidly, and to exploit geographic knowledge of the steppe against opponents who did not have it. The Pecheneg camp, the yurt cluster settlement that served as a temporary home for a family group or a gathering of families, was designed for rapid assembly and disassembly. The felt tent yurt, that was the characteristic dwelling of the steppe peoples, could be erected by experienced hands in under an hour and disassembled in comparable time, loaded onto carts or pack animals, and moved across the steppe in a day's travel. This was not primitive accommodation. A well-made yurt provided genuine insulation against the steppe's temperature extremes, was waterproof, was ventilated through the adjustable roof ring, and was large enough to house a family in reasonable comfort. The specific engineering of the yurt, the interlocking lattice walls, the curved roof poles, the tension structure that made the whole form self-supporting without internal posts, represented centuries of design development oriented toward a specific problem: how to build a dwelling that performs as well as a permanent structure, but can be moved as easily as furniture. The kurgan, the burial mound that is the most visible archaeological trace of the steppe nomadic peoples, was the one permanent structure that the Pechenegs built, and they built it for the dead rather than the living. The kurgan mounds that dot the steppe landscape across the territory from Hungary to Kazakhstan represent thousands of years of accumulated burial practice, with the largest and most elaborately furnished belonging to the most prominent individuals. The Pecheneg kurgans excavated by archaeologists in Ukraine and Romania have yielded assemblages of weapons, horse equipment, personal ornaments, and occasionally the skeletons of horses buried with their owners. Evidence of a burial practice that treated horses as companions in the afterlife, as well as in this life. The archaeological investigation of Pecheneg kurgans has been the primary method of recovering material evidence of the civilization, since they left no cities to excavate, no temples to uncover, no palace archives to interpret, the burial mounds are almost the only physical record. The specific assemblages found in these mounds, and particularly the distribution of silver and gold objects that appear to be Byzantine diplomatic gifts, identifiable by their Byzantine manufacture and their appearance in steppe burial contexts, document the specific commercial and diplomatic relationship between Byzantium and the Pechenegs in material terms. Payments the Byzantines made to the Pechenegs ended up in their graves, and those graves are now telling us what the historical sources could only partially record. The specific Kurgan excavations that have contributed most to our understanding of Pecheneg material culture include several in Romania, particularly in the Danube Delta region, and in Wallachia, that date from the period of maximum Pecheneg presence in the western steppe. The Romanian excavations, conducted primarily in the second half of the 20th century, recovered assemblages that are consistent with the Pecheneg cultural tradition as identified in Ukrainian sites, but that also reflect the specific material culture exchanges that occurred when Pecheneg groups were in sustained contact with the sedentary agricultural populations of the Balkan region. Byzantine ceramics, metalwork of Byzantine and Bulgarian origin, and textile fragments that appear to be of either Byzantine or Rus manufacture appear in these Western Pecheneg burial contexts, alongside the standard steppe nomadic assemblages of weapons, horse gear, and personal ornaments. The religious beliefs of the Pechenegs centered on Tengri, the sky god, the supreme divine principle of the Turkic and Mongol religious traditions, understood as the overarching cosmic order under which human life was lived and military success was granted or withheld. Tengri was not a personal deity in the sense that the Abrahamic traditions understood divine personality. He was more a principle than a person, present in the blue sky above the steppe and manifested in the fortune of those who lived in accordance with his will. The specific relationship between Tengri's will and human military success was one that steppe peoples took seriously. A great Khan's victories were evidence of Tengri's favor, and a great defeat was evidence of Tengri's withdrawal of that favor, which made political defeat simultaneously a military and a theological crisis. Alongside Tengri, the Pechenegs maintained a complex of beliefs about the spirits inhabiting natural features, rivers, mountains, specific trees, specific animals, that were propitiated through regular offerings and managed through the intervention of religious specialists. The shamanic tradition, the specialist who could communicate with the spirit world, diagnose the causes of illness and misfortune, and conduct the ceremonies needed to restore right relationships between the human community and the forces governing its fate, was present in Pecheneg society as in virtually all steppe nomadic traditions. The Byzantine sources that describe Pecheneg religious practice do so from the outside, with the specific incomprehension of Orthodox Christian observers encountering a religious tradition entirely outside their own framework. The horse sacrifices that accompanied the burial of prominent Pechenegs, documented both in Byzantine accounts and in the archaeological record of Kurgan excavations, were not mere ceremony. They reflected a genuine cosmological belief that the horse was the appropriate companion for the warrior in the afterlife, and that the proper conduct of burial rites was essential for the deceased's well-being in the next world and for the community's own protection against the potentially dangerous presence of the improperly buried dead. The horses found in Pecheneg period kurgans are typically large, well-bred animals, the best of the deceased's herd, placed with their equipment intact, suggesting that the investment in the burial sacrifice was understood as an investment in the deceased's continued effectiveness in whatever form of existence followed death. The gradual conversion of some Pecheneg groups to Orthodox Christianity, occurring primarily through contact with the Byzantine population of the Balkans and the Russian principalities, was not a wholesale abandonment of the Tengrist tradition, but a layering of Christian practice over existing beliefs. The Pecheneg converts, who appear in Byzantine military records from the late 10th and early 11th centuries, serving as frontier guards and mercenary forces, maintained dual religious identities that Byzantine sources found confusing, but that were entirely consistent with the pragmatic religious syncretism of steppe cultures that adopted useful elements from any available tradition. The Pecheneg practice of offering animal sacrifices, particularly horses, at burial sites is documented in the Byzantine accounts of funeral practices and confirmed in the archaeological record of excavated kurgans. The specific ritual treatment of horse remains in Pecheneg burials. The placement of horse heads and lower legs alongside the human burial, rather than the burial of complete horse skeletons, is a practice that distinguishes Pecheneg burial customs from those of some neighboring steppe peoples, and that has been interpreted as reflecting a specific cosmological understanding of the horse's role in facilitating the deceased's transition to the afterlife. The head and hooves are the parts of the horse most visually associated with its identity and its movement. The head represents the animal's consciousness and agency. The hooves represent its capacity for travel, and their preservation in burial may have been understood as preserving the essential spiritual attributes of the horse companion, while allowing the rest of the animal's material substance to be consumed in the feast that accompanied the funeral ceremony. The technological achievements of the Pechenegs were concentrated in the specific technologies required for excellence in the pastoral and military life of the steppe. Horse management and breeding, weapons design, navigation across featureless terrain, and the preservation and transport of food across the distances that military campaigns required. The composite recurve bow represents the steppe nomadic tradition's most significant technological contribution, a weapon design whose specific properties emerged from centuries of incremental improvement in materials selection, lamination techniques, and the specific geometry of the bow's curvature. The bow's effectiveness depended on the careful selection and preparation of the horn used for the inner face, typically the horn of domestic cattle or wild bovines, chosen for specific mechanical properties and prepared through a process of heating and shaping that required considerable skill and experience. The sinew for the outer face had to be prepared from specific animal tendons, dried and stretched in ways that preserved its tensile properties. The wood of the core had to be selected for a specific combination of stiffness and springiness. The assembly of these components with appropriate adhesives and the subsequent finishing process that brought the completed bow to its final shape and power level was a craft that required years of apprenticeship to master. The stirrup, whose specific origins and diffusion are debated, but which appears in the steppe nomadic context before spreading to European and Asian cavalry traditions, was a technological innovation whose military implications were profound. The ability to stand in the stirrups while shooting, to use the leverage of the stirrups to deliver a more powerful blow in melee combat, and to maintain stability on horseback during the abrupt direction changes of cavalry combat, transformed what a mounted warrior could do. The Pechenegs and their contemporaries used stirrups as standard equipment, and the evidence from Pecheneg period burial sites, where elaborate decorated stirrups are among the most commonly found metal objects, confirms both the practical importance of the stirrup and the social significance of high-quality stirrup craftsmanship as a marker of warrior status. The navigation technology that steppe peoples used to traverse what appeared to outside observers as a featureless, directionless landscape was sophisticated in ways that are difficult to document from the written record. But that can be inferred from the practical requirements of the movement patterns the historical and archaeological evidence describes. Moving large groups across the steppe with their herds, their carts, their camp equipment required. Knowing not just where you were going, but where the water sources were, where the best pasture was in different seasons, where rival groups were located, and what the weather patterns of the specific micro-region suggested about conditions in the coming weeks. This knowledge was accumulated across generations and transmitted through oral tradition. The practical instruction of experienced leaders had to basket that was part of daily life in the steppe environment. The specific contribution of steppe nomadic military technology to the subsequent development of medieval European warfare is a topic that military historians have been examining with increasing rigor since late 20th century. The composite bow, the stirrup, the specific saddle designs that allowed effective mounted archery. All of these technologies moved from the steppe nomadic world into European military practice through the repeated contacts that the steppe people's periodic incursions into European territory forced. The Pechenegs were not the first steppe people to transmit these technologies westward, and they were not the last. But their 2 centuries of sustained pressure on the Byzantine and Rus frontiers were one of the primary channels through which the specific military knowledge of the Eurasian steppe entered the European military tradition. The Byzantine relationship with the Pechenegs was the most important and most extensively documented of the Pechenegs' external relationships. But it was not the only one, and the full context of the Pechenegs' eventual destruction requires understanding the constellation of forces that converged against them in the late 11th century. Kievan Rus, the East Slavic state centered on Kiev and the Dnieper River, had been in intermittent conflict with the Pechenegs for most of the 10th and 11th centuries. The Rus needed the Dnieper trade route, and the Pechenegs taxed and raided it. It's the Rus prince Sviatoslav Avisis, who tried to establish Rus military dominance over the Balkan region in the 960s and early 970s, was killed by the Pechenegs near the Dnieper Rapids in 972, reportedly with his skull turned into a ceremonial cup by the Pecheneg leader Kuria. Burial honor in the Pecheneg tradition applied to a defeated enemy of sufficient stature. The skull cup story, documented in the primary chronicle of Kievan Rus, has been the subject of some historical skepticism, but the Pecheneg custom of turning the skulls of honored enemies into drinking vessels is documented in multiple sources and is consistent with archaeological evidence from steppe burial contexts. The Cumans, the steppe people who appeared east of Pecheneg territory in the early 11th century and who would eventually occupy the same Pontic steppe after the Pechenegs' destruction, were the direct military pressure that fundamentally altered the Pecheneg position in the late 11th century. Cuman pressure from the east was pushing the Pechenegs westward and southward, reducing their territorial base, straining their food resources, and generating the military and social stress that was producing the internal fragmentation visible in the historical sources of the period. The Pechenegs, who crossed the Danube into Byzantine territory in large numbers in the late 11th century, were not simply raiding. They were migrating, driven by the pressure from behind rather than the attraction of Byzantine wealth in front. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who came to the throne in 1081 and would rule for 37 years, faced the Pecheneg threat as one of the most pressing problems of his early reign. His solution was strategic: negotiate an alliance with the Cumans, who had their own interest in eliminating the Pechenegs from the steppe territory both peoples wanted to control, and use the combined Byzantine-Cuman force to engage the Pechenegs under conditions that maximized the military advantage. The negotiations that brought the Cumans into the alliance were a significant achievement of Byzantine foreign policy, and the military result validated the investment. The destruction of the Pecheneg Confederation at Livonian was one of the most complete military victories of the medieval period. The specific role of the Pecheneg pressure in shaping Kievan Rus' political development is one that Rus' historians have examined in detail since the recovery of the primary chronicle in its various redactions became possible. The fortification network that Vladimir I and Yaroslav I built along the Rus-Pecheneg frontier, the Zmievi Valley earthworks, some of which survive in fragmentary form in the Ukrainian landscape, was the physical expression of a sustained defensive investment that consumed significant quantities of labor and material resources over multiple reigns. The specific architectural form of these earthworks, earthen ramparts reinforced with timber palisades, running for dozens of kilometers along ridgelines that offered the best defensive terrain, reflects the specific tactical requirements of defending against a mounted archery force that could appear from any direction along the steppe frontier. The Pechenegs, at their maximum extent, roughly the mid-10th century, approximately 50 to 100 years after their arrival in the Pontic steppe, controlled a territory stretching from the lower Danube in the west to the Don River in the east, from the forest steppe boundary in the north to the Black Sea coast in the south. This was not a territory in the sense of a defined political unit with borders enforced by permanent garrison. It was a sphere of control, the space within which Pecheneg groups moved freely, within which rivals moved at risk, and within which the political relationships that organized the Pontic steppe were defined primarily by Pecheneg power. The military force that sustained this controls was, by the estimates that can be drawn from Byzantine and other sources, large enough to be a genuine great power on the military scale of the period. Byzantine sources mention Pecheneg armies of 80,000 to 100, Zu-0 men in their descriptions of major encounters, figures that are almost certainly exaggerated, but that reflect the genuine military mass that fully mobilized Pecheneg Confederation could bring to the field. Even discounting for Byzantine tendency to inflate enemy numbers, the Pechenegs could put cavalry forces in the field that no Byzantine army of the period could meet on equal terms in open steppe conditions. The commercial revenues that the Pechenegs extracted from their geographic position, the Dnieper trade route tolls, the Byzantine tribute payments, the periodic ransoms from captured travelers and merchants, the trade in goods obtained through raiding, gave the Confederacy enough wealth to maintain the material standard that successful steppe military culture required: weapons, horses, and the prestige goods that marked social status and sustained the political allegiances of the clan leaders. The accumulated wealth visible in the Kurgan burials of the period, gold and silver ornaments, imported silk, Byzantine coins, high-quality weapons, represents the material expression of a polity that was, in its own terms, genuinely prosperous. The cultural confidence of the Pechenegs at their peak is visible in the specific way they conducted their relationship with Byzantium. They did not petition for Byzantine favor. They extracted it. The payments they received were not gifts but tribute, the material acknowledgement by one of the most powerful states in the medieval world that the Pechenegs were a force to be reckoned with. Constantine VII's advice about distributing gifts to all Pecheneg clan leaders simultaneously was not the advice of an empire dealing with a subordinate. It was the advice of an empire managing a relationship with a peer whose goodwill needed to be purchased because it could not be compelled. The specific diplomatic relationship that Byzantium maintained with the Pechenegs at the peak of Pecheneg power during the period, documented in De Administrando Imperio, was organized around a system of gift distribution that Constantine VII describes with unusual precision for a Byzantine imperial administrative text. The gifts were calibrated, specific quantities of silk, specific numbers of gold coins, specific categories of luxury goods, distributed to specific categories of Pecheneg leader. The calibration reflected an understanding of Pecheneg internal politics, the need to distribute gifts in ways that did not elevate any single leader's status at the expense of others, which would create intertribal tensions that could destabilize the relationship. Managing the Byzantine gift distribution was, in effect, managing Pecheneg internal politics from the outside, a sophisticated exercise in indirect influence that required detailed knowledge of the Pecheneg social hierarchy and its specific sensitivities. The crisis that destroyed the Pechenegs unfolded over approximately 2 decades before the final Battle of Lebanon in 1091. Its primary drivers were external military pressure and internal fragmentation, and the two processes were mutually reinforcing in ways that made recovery progressively more difficult. The Cuman arrival on the eastern steppe, beginning in the early 11th century, was the primary external pressure. The Cumans, also Turkic-speaking kin steppe nomads, with a military tradition similar to the Pechenegs, but arriving from the east with the energy of a group that had not yet spent 2 centuries fighting in a contested frontier zone, pushed the Pechenegs steadily westward. The western movement of Pecheneg groups brought them into the Byzantine Danube frontier zone in numbers, and with a desperation that made the usual Byzantine diplomatic toolkit inadequate. Payments that had previously secured Pecheneg cooperation now purchased only temporary restraint from groups that had nowhere else to go. The internal fragmentation of the Pecheneg Confederation, visible in the historical sources as increasing inability to coordinate military and diplomatic policy across the 8 tribes, was partly a consequence of the external pressure and partly a continuation of structural tendencies that had always been present in the Confederation's decentralized organization. Leaders whose factions had suffered losses in the fighting with the Cumans or the Byzantines had incentives to make separate deals rather than coordinating collective response. Byzantine policy actively exploited these divisions, offering favorable terms to specific Pecheneg leaders in exchange for unitary service against their Pecheneg rivals, a tactic that produced the spectacle of Pecheneg units fighting for Byzantium against other Pecheneg units, further degrading whatever remained of Confederation cohesion. The specific events of the decade before Livonion, described in detail in the chronicle of Anna Komnene, the Emperor Alexios' daughter, whose Alexiad is the most detailed narrative source for the period, show a Pecheneg population that had moved largely across the Danube into Byzantine Thrace, was living off the agricultural surplus of the region through a combination of forced requisition and raiding, and it was simultaneously being pressured from the east by the Cumans, who were following in their wake. The Pechenegs of this period were not the confident masters of the steppe that their predecessors had been. They were refugees, dangerous, numerous, and desperate, occupying a geographical and political space that their enemies on multiple sides were simultaneously trying to eliminate. The specifics as Pechenegs military operations in Byzantine territory, the period of maximum pressure in the early 1090s, documented in Anna Komnena's Alexiad and in the administrative correspondence of the Alexios Vice period, shows a military situation of genuine desperation. Pecheneg raiding parties were operating within a day's march of Constantinople itself. The Byzantine provincial administration of Thrace had effectively collapsed Koplaish, with local populations either sheltering behind city walls or paying their own tribute to whichever Pecheneg group controlled their immediate area. The Byzantine imperial army, depleted by the disasters of the late 11th century, including the catastrophic defeat at Manzikert in 1071 against Seljuk Turks, lacked the military mass to confront the Pecheneg numbers in open battle. The specific desperation of the Byzantine strategic situation in the years before Levunion is the context that makes Alexios VI's Cuman alliance comprehensible. It was not a brilliant diplomatic maneuver in conditions of Byzantine strength, but an emergency improvisation in conditions of strategic crisis. The Battle of Levunion was fought on April 29, 1091, at or near the confluence of the Maritsa and Tunza rivers in what is now European Turkey, close to the modern city of Edirne. The battle was not simply a military engagement between two armies. It was a planned destruction of a population, the culmination of a campaign in which Byzantine and Cuman forces had coordinated specifically to catch the main Pecheneg encampment, including the non-combatant population, in a position from which escape was impossible. The Cumans, approaching from the north and east, under their leaders Togatak and Maniak, had been brought into an alliance with Alexios through negotiations that gave them a share of the expected loot. The combined force caught the Pechenegs, encamped near the river. The specifics of the battle are not documented in detail in the surviving sources, but the outcome is not in doubt. Anna Komnena's Alexiad describes the aftermath with the phrase that has echoed through the historiography ever since. A people so numerous they were like the stars in number, or like the sand of the sea, all perished in a single day. The scale of the killing has been interpreted in different ways by different historians. The phrase, perished in a single day, is almost certainly rhetorical. Large-scale military operations do not conclude in a single day, but the evidence of the subsequent historical record, the near-complete disappearance of any Pecheneg presence in Byzantine or Rus sources after 1091, suggests that the destruction was genuine and comprehensive. The population that had been numerous enough to threaten Byzantine survival as recently as the early 1090s was, within a generation, effectively gone from the historical record as an independent political entity. The survivors, and there must have been survivors, were absorbed into other political entities. Some Pechenegs were incorporated into the Byzantine military as frontier guards and mercenaries. Others were absorbed into the Cuman Confederation that now occupied the steppe they had vacated. Small groups appear in Hungarian, Rus, and Bulgarian sources over the following century, as fragments of a dissolved people seeking accommodation with whatever power-controlled territory they found themselves in. But the Pechenegs, as a coherent political and cultural entity, as the people who had terrorized Byzantine frontiers, driven the Magyars into Hungary, and extracted tribute from one of the most powerful states in the medieval world, were gone. The specific aftermath of Levunion, the Byzantine use of surviving Pechenegs as military auxiliaries and frontier guards, documents a pattern that appears repeatedly in Byzantine military history. The rapid integration of defeated enemies into the Byzantine military system. The Pechenegs, who survived the battle and subsequent pursuit, were not exterminated or enslaved in the Roman tradition. They were recruited, offered land, military stipends, and a formal place in the Byzantine military organization in exchange for service against future steppe threats. The specific groups documented in later Byzantine military records as Pecheneg units, the Vardariotai stationed in Macedonia, small groups scattered across the Balkan frontier zones, were the remnants of a confederacy that had terrorized the same frontier they were now defending. Byzantine pragmatism about the use of former enemies as military auxiliaries was one of the empire's characteristic institutional strengths. The archaeological investigation of Pecheneg material culture has been conducted primarily in Ukraine, Romania, and Hungary, the territories that Pecheneg groups occupied during the period of their historical prominence. The results are informative but constrained by the specific character of nomadic material culture, which leaves a different and in some ways more limited archaeological signature than the sedentary civilizations whose physical remains dominate the conventional narrative of medieval history. The Kurgan burial mounds that are the most visible Pecheneg archaeological feature have been excavated since the 19th century, with increasingly systematic approaches applied from the mid-20th century onward. The assemblages recovered from Pecheneg period kurgans are distinctive enough to allow their identification. The specific combinations of weapons, sabers, spears, composite bow components, arrowheads, horse equipment, saddles, stirrups, bridle ornaments, personal ornaments, belt fittings, jewelry, clothing decorations, and occasional imported goods, Byzantine coins and ceramics. Silk fragments provide a material profile that archaeologists have used to map the distribution of Pecheneg activity across the steppe zone. The ancient DNA research applied to Pecheneg's skeletal remains represents the most significant recent addition to the evidence base. Studies published in the 2010s and 2020s analyzing genomes from individuals buried in kurgans attributed to the Pecheneg period have confirmed the broad genetic affiliation with other Eurasian steppe Turkic populations, while also documenting considerable internal diversity. Consistent with a confederation that incorporated individuals from multiple origins over its 2 centuries of steppe dominance. The specific genetic signatures identified in Pecheneg remains have been detected in modern populations of the region, particularly in Hungary, Romania, and Ukraine, providing a molecular trace of the Pecheneg presence that survived the political and cultural disappearance of the Confederation. The question of where the Pechenegs went after Levenion is one that the historical record answers only partially. The documentary evidence for the post-1091 period shows scattered references to individuals and small groups identified as Pechenegs or Pecheneg, descendants in various regional contexts, Byzantine military registers, Hungarian chronicles, Rus diplomatic documents, but nothing suggesting the survival of any organized Pecheneg political entity. The genetic evidence, to the extent that it can be interpreted across the gap of a millennium, suggests that the Pecheneg population was not physically destroyed, but was politically dissolved, absorbed into the surrounding populations through a combination of forced integration, voluntary assimilation, and the gradual loss of the specific cultural markers that had defined Pecheneg identity. The lesson that the Pecheneg story most insistently teaches is about the specific vulnerability of military power that lacks the institutional depth to survive defeat. The Pechenegs were, for 2 centuries, among the most formidable military forces in the medieval world. They maintained that position through military excellence and geographic advantage, extracting payments from the most powerful state in their world, and maintaining a reputation for invincibility that was expensive for others to test. But their military power was not grounded in the kind of institutional development, urban centers, written administration, religious organization, add to basket economic specialization that gives a civilization resilience against catastrophic defeat. When the defeat came, there was nothing to rebuild from. No institutional infrastructure, no written tradition, no urban centers, no religious institutions. What remains is the Kurgan mounds in the Ukrainian steppe, the DNA signatures in modern Eastern European populations, the specific words that passed from Turkic steppe languages into Hungarian and Romanian and Ukrainian, and the records of the people who feared them enough to write about them. That is the entire legacy of a people who made Rome's successor pay tribute for 2 centuries. It is enough to tell the story. It is not enough to answer the question of what they understood themselves to be in the years before Levunion, when they were still the most feared warriors in the world.